Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm slowly letting more people in from the waiting room. Welcome to Impact of Trauma from Generation to Generation. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. I'm Chris Kellogg from Jewish Family Service of St. Paul, and I will be running the technical stuff in the background. A couple things. I thought I had set it so that everyone's camera was off. If you wouldn't mind, please turn your camera off because there are so many of us. We're expecting well over 100 people, and it's kind of disconcerting when you see too many faces. And your microphones should all be muted as well. If it isn't for some reason, please mute it. Again, having background noise can make it hard for everyone to hear Dr. Felsen. I want to thank our partners. They are JFCS of Minneapolis, the St. Paul JCC, Ham Clinic, and Shalom Alliance. And I also missed, I'm sorry, JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council. And I also want to thank very much the Jewish Federations of North America for the grant that funded this event. And at this point, I'm going to introduce Dr. Felsen, and then I will turn it over to you.
I just wanted to mention, Chris, we have 16 people in the waiting room.
Oh, thank you. Having a hard time getting my thing to go to the waiting room and admit people. There we go.
Chris, I sent an email for the second session tonight. I received the link, but I did not get it. I don't know where it is.
Can you put that in the chat, please?
Link for the 8 o'clock session.
Yeah, could you put that in the chat, please?
Try. Yeah, I was trying to find you in the chat, so I didn't. Sure.
Okay.
I sent you an email, but that.
Okay.
I figured you're here, so you're not looking at that.
So again, if everyone would please mute. Just two more things I wanted to make you aware of, that as you are participating in this event, you may find these helpful. I want to let you know about JFS's Holocaust Survivors Program, where we provide survivors and their caregivers with support, information, and services that you need to remain independent and successful in your own home. We also have a program to encourage active and rewarding lives for seniors. That's also known as PEARLS. And that also is a program targeted at elders and their caregivers who are suffering from depression. You can find out more information about both of these programs by either replying to the email where I sent you the link, or you can also go to our website and find it there. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Felsen. We're so pleased that you're here tonight. Dr. Felsen is a clinical psychologist, born and raised in Israel, but currently living in New York. She is herself the daughter of 2 Holocaust surviving parents, and she has been working with Holocaust survivors and their families for over 25 years. Her research is focused on the long-term effects of trauma and the intergenerational transmission of the effect in Holocaust families. She's an adjunct professor at Columbia University, and she's also in private practice in New York and New Jersey. She is currently the chair of the Older Adults Groups in the American Psychological Association Interdisciplinary COVID-19 Task Force, that's a mouthful, and the co-chair of the Trauma Working Group at the NGO on Mental Health in the UN. So as you can see, she's very well qualified to talk to us tonight. So I'm really excited to introduce her and to start learning from her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Just to mention to you, I'm seeing the people in the waiting room on my screen.
Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing and let you share yours.
Excellent. So let me see. I'm going to go to just 1 second. Make it bigger. Okay. So I'm very, very happy to be here with you today. I would have been even happier to be there in person, but this is wonderful that we can do this in these times. And we'll start this marathon of meetings that some of you will be joining us for parts of, some of you will be with us for all of it. With this presentation, I'm hoping that the notice about the people in the waiting room will not continue to distract all along, but we'll do the best we can. So at this point in our history, as the survivors are passing, today, in fact, I lost a very, very dear friend who was a survivor and 96 years old. She passed away this morning. And as they are passing away and leaving us with their legacy, and already there are, of course, people who try to deny the fact that this incredible event happened, the Holocaust. I start by showing the only photograph that I have of my father's family. There was no photograph at all left after the war from my mother's family. She was the sole survivor of her family of 7 siblings. And this is my father and his sisters. This was a photograph that was taken when one of the daughters, the eldest daughter, had gone already away from Poland, and it was sent to her. So that lad in the back is my father with all his sisters. And this is a wonderful man whom I love very much, who lives in Haifa, who was supposed to be marrying my father's youngest daughter. And he's holding this picture that I showed you. And he managed to escape from the ghetto, and my aunt stayed with her parents. She didn't want to leave them alone, so she perished. So I will start by talking about the fact that PTSD, what we call today PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and PTS, post-traumatic stress, was something that has a very strange history in our field. It sort of was recognized quite well after World War I. There are beautiful descriptions of it, beautiful in the sense of how precise they were, by Abram Cardiner, a psychiatrist who actually worked in New York at Columbia University. And he described exactly what we would describe today as post-traumatic reactions in veterans of World War I. And then all of this was kind of forgotten. And by the time World War II ended and there were all these casualties, civilian and combat veterans that suffered from what they have been through and what they saw, it had to be sort of reinvented all again. And then there was a lot of knowledge collected. It was forgotten again. And by the time the Vietnam War came around, I sometimes show my students a quote from a very prestigious psychiatric journal in this country from 1970, where a very respected psychiatrist stated there are no mental health casualties amongst the veterans returning from the Vietnam conflict. Of course, he had to retract it very shortly thereafter. So what I'm trying to say is that the history of trauma and its impact on people, its long-lasting impact, has a strange history of being forgotten each time again, not coincidentally, but because it's so hard for us, for the victims, for the perpetrators, for society, for the professional mental health people facing the casualties, to recognize and acknowledge that traumatic events can have such a long-lasting impact on the lives of individuals and on societies. The studies on Holocaust survivors began to appear only after about 20 years from the end of World War II, and the studies about the second generation began to appear in the early 70s. And they are particularly relevant for our understanding of the effect of trauma and the long-term effects of trauma on survivors and on their families and their descendants, because by now we have the largest body of knowledge about this population, and it has informed along the way the studies in other more recent trauma exposed populations. So the early observations about the survivors, when we started having some more systematic papers about it, the first thing that has to be stressed is that there was a great variability amongst the survivors in many, many ways, in their background features before the war, and in the socioeconomic status that their families had, in their levels of education, occupational skills, and also there was a great heterogeneity in the experiences that they had during the Holocaust, and of course also in the post-war circumstances that they met after the war. Some went to Israel, some spent years in DP camps, some went to America, all over the place, and very different welcome circumstances. So a lot of heterogeneity. And despite of this heterogeneity, certain psychological features have been kind of universally observed by the late 60s and referred to as the survivor syndrome. And it included symptoms of depression and anxiety reactions, unresolved mourning, guilt, often not because somebody did something wrong, but what was referred to in the literature as survivor guilt. You know, why did I survive when my entire family didn't? Agitation, insomnia, nightmares, and all kinds of somatic conditions, all kinds of pain conditions and other somatic conditions. Based on the studies in Holocaust families, we now speak of historical trauma, and we now recognize the transmission of trauma from generation to generation, also in other survivor populations, as I said, such as Native Americans or First Nations in Canada, American Blacks, survivors of the Armenian genocide, American Japanese who were interned in the United States during World War II, survivors of the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia, and many other, unfortunately, more recent populations that were exposed to mass traumatic events. What is trauma? So trauma is an event, it results from an event in actual reality, in external reality, an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that are experienced by the individual as incredibly harmful or threatening, and that have some adverse lasting effects on those exposed to them. And that event in reality, which caused the trauma, we call it the index trauma, and is a necessary defining element in what we consider to be PTSD today, post-traumatic disorder. It's post-traumatic, it's always related to a certain external event or set of circumstances. But as you can see from the definition, the focus is very much on the subjective impact. And different survivors came out of the Holocaust feeling with different levels of symptomatology, and some people got better faster, and some people suffered from more pervasive symptoms and for a longer duration of time. So the subjective element in the response to trauma is a very, very important one, and a great source of, again, heterogeneity in the survivor population. You know, again, as I said very quickly, this is important for, at least for, especially for those of us who are in the mental health professions. The definition of post-traumatic stress disorder was revised in 2013. It's often been revised throughout the various editions event, which is it's the only mental health disorder in the entire DSM system that is related directly to an external event that happened to the person. And then it has a few clusters of symptoms. One is the cluster of intrusive phenomena, which includes all of the thoughts and nightmares and dissociative reactions and the distress and physiological reactions to triggers, such as, including, by the way, things that happen while one is awake, intrusive phenomena that one experiences while one is awake, and nightmare and flashbacks and so forth. Yesterday, I actually spoke with a survivor, a new patient, lovely man, who told me that, for example, he passed by a store and he saw a hat which was very similar to the hat that the Hitler Jugend, sort of the Nazi youth movement in Hungary used to wear, and that he has such a strong reaction to things like that. And these are unexpected triggers that one comes across. They are unpredictable, and one can often have a very strong reaction to it, and that's very disturbing, obviously. The other cluster of symptoms is symptoms that have to do with trying to avoid thoughts, feelings, and all kinds of external stimuli that would trigger the individual. So people try to stay away from it, and it leads sometimes to a certain constriction in their activities or in who they want to meet, because they don't want to be triggered by them or by the situation. And the new element that was added to the DSM in 2013 was cluster D, which pertains to sort of pervasive, long-lasting alterations, changes, negative changes in one's way of feeling about the world, about oneself, one's philosophy of life, one's view of important things in life, negative beliefs, as feelings of being sort of a foreigner in the world, feelings of alienation, feeling of detachment from others, all of these things, which really are much more characteristic indeed of people who survived long and pervasive traumatic events, such as the Holocaust, such as a genocide, such as war, such as prolonged maltreatment, as opposed to people who, let's say, have PTSD because of one very bad, but a single event of a traumatic nature, such as an accident or even an assault. And the last cluster is alteration in levels of arousal, which means, as many of us know, survivors often are more easily irritable. They can be very hypervigilant. They can be very much, they can suffer from a strong startle response whenever there's a strong unexpected sound. They have sleep disturbances and all of those things that are part of this hyper arousal, chronic hyper arousal. And this chronic hyperarousal is, by the way, something that, of course, has also relationships to how patient and how pleasant they can be due to the toll that it takes upon, that it exerts upon them. So exposure to trauma is actually quite frequent in the general population in the United States. And the United States is not the most unsafe place around the globe. So between 60 and 90% of the general population will actually have exposure to an event that we could define formally as a traumatic event based on the definition in the DSM. However, only a relatively small percent of those exposed will go on to develop the disorder, the chronic disorder of post-traumatic stress. So about 8%, a little bit more women than men, will develop the disorder. Of course, there are certain populations within the United States where there are much, much higher rates due to living under conditions that are unsafe, conditions of scarcity and conditions of poverty. So the most common traumatic experience, as it would seem from the data collected by the World Health Organization, is the death of a loved one. About 30% of people, based on multiple national surveys, would say that this is the most common, and that is the most common trauma reported by people in all of these surveys. I apologize. And the next thing is witnessing violence to others. And the third the third most common is experiencing interpersonal violence. When you think about it this way, there are a lot of people now following what we are living through who will have gone through the death of a loved one, the death of someone they know, and who have witnessed violence to others. And that will be something that we need to keep in mind. We know that what we call malignant trauma is much more damaging even than natural disasters and accidents. So while natural disasters and accidents are terrible in and of themselves because people get hurt and people get frightened and people lose loved ones and people lose possessions and homes, malignant trauma is a trauma that is perpetrated with the intent to hurt by some people against other people. And even though studies of such traumas that are usually political persecution, all kinds of terrible things that happen by people against people, these are the studies that look such traumatic events usually occur several years after the event, as opposed to studies that examine what is the situation right after a natural disaster or some big accident. Despite the fact that these studies are conducted years later, we find that the damage caused by it, by malignant trauma, by human perpetrated trauma, is much greater because it has an added feature. It has the added feature of malintent, of malevolent intent, of people being able to be incredibly cruel with intentionality. And that sort of shatters our beliefs about what human beings are and what is our place in the world amongst our fellow human beings. And I also want to quote a short piece of a poem by Szymborska. The other thing that that happens following trauma is that a lot of other world assumptions get shattered, not only about other people and what they are and what they're capable of, but also about safety, about our basic safety and about our control and about our ability to be in charge of our lives and of our safety and of being able to judge what to do. And this randomness that so many survivors describe about lucky circumstances that allowed them to stay alive is captured by this poem. As she says, "You were saved because you were the first. You were saved because you were the last, alone, with others, on the right, the left." And this is so true, I find, in so many of the many stories of survivors that I've heard by now. The sun was in their eyes, so they couldn't see that we were standing there. It was dark, so they couldn't see that we were lying in the hole in the ground. It's tiny things this way or that way that many times determined whether one could survive or not. And that totally shatters one's sense of safety. What is most important, of course, is the fact that many survivors have lived through seeing the worst in people. And so it's not only the Nazis, which of course that was, they saw terrible things perpetrated by the Nazis. And there are horrific stories which we all, I think, know. And there were also others that participated, betrayal trauma sometimes by spiritual leaders, by people that they were supposed to trust. Many child survivors felt betrayed by their parents, although their parents left them with others in order to save them. But for a small child, the experience might be of being abandoned and betrayed. And even though the adult afterwards understands it differently, it doesn't necessarily totally undo the traumatic feeling of the child. So I have the story of my own father, who was rescued by a man who then was betrayed by his own brother. His own brother told the Gestapo that he was hiding Jews in his home, and the Gestapo came and arrested him and his wife, and they were both executed in the central square of the town. Dr. Rosa, a survivor with whom I had the honor of presenting at a conference a few years ago, described a terribly, terribly traumatic experience, which was actually perpetrated by a priest. So a lot of people who later are looked at differently by survivors of trauma. I mean, a priest, yeah, I don't know who you really are. A brother, a cousin, family, rabbi, I don't know who you really are, is a kind of a feeling, and trust has to be very much earned. It's not taken for granted anymore. There were also a lot of normal people, so to speak, not perpetrators per se, but normal people, neighbors, and townspeople who enthusiastically seized the opportunity to profit from the terrible situation that forced the Jews to flee and to abandon their properties. If you would like, I recommend a documentary that Billy Joel, the singer, created about his family, the Joel Files, the story of two families, and how his father had to abandon essentially his tremendously successful big business, sell it for peanuts to the Nazi who otherwise he would have anyway had to just flee and leave it. He couldn't take it. He had to sell it for whatever he could get. And there were even neighbors who initiated a sports, the hunt for the Jews, the Judenjagd, hunting for hidden Jews and being rewarded for it by the Nazis. So what are other people really about is a question that is profoundly embedded in the experience of people who have seen what people can do under terrible circumstances. And that becomes the trauma lens, so to speak. And in SAMSHA, in one of SAMSHA's guideline documents, which I strongly recommend to the professionals amongst us, it states, trauma can serve as a filter or a lens through which a person views the world. Think of sunglasses. You put them on and everything is shaded differently. Trauma can have that type of effect on how a person perceives their world. And Stolorow, a psychoanalyst, had written a book called Trauma and Human Existence, in which he describes both his theoretical thoughts about the topic and his personal experience having lost his very young wife. And he says there are normals and there are those who survived trauma and traumatic loss. And for those who survived traumatic loss, the illusion of safety is shattered. The other ones, luckily, can still live with that illusion, but not those of us who have lived through trauma. So I call a similar concept the dual reality of survivors and of survivors of the Holocaust and of other extreme traumatic experiences, which means that they live forever. Survivors who lived through such extreme traumatic experiences live forever after the end of the trauma in two parallel realities in a way. And these parallel realities are incongruent. They're not really compatible with each other. One is the reality of the trauma, where inconceivable experiences, horrific experiences did indeed happen, and color every other as a potential perpetrator, potential potential danger, and where the behavior of the self at the trauma reality was determined singularly by the desperate effort to survive. The reality of the here and now is the reality of life after the trauma in the relative safety of where the survivor found himself after the Holocaust, whether it was the United States or even Israel, despite all of its security issues, or Canada or Australia, as a society that behaves according to what we consider socially acceptable norms, socially desirable behavior. You know, we teach our children in that kind of a situation to not push, to give the other person a turn, to maybe even let the other person go ahead of us to the plate that's on the table. In the reality of trauma, it's very different. In the reality of trauma, one pushes and one tries to get first to the plate, and the only consideration is how can one stay alive for another day. And these realities exist for survivors parallel to each other, yet they have to be somewhat separated if one is to be able to adjust to life after the end of the trauma. And so what I say as a metaphor for us to think about it is, imagine that we live in a world that has a glass floor. The reality of trauma and all of the atrocities that happened during that trauma lies underneath that glass floor, like a terrible picture, or all the images of the terrible things that happened are there under the glass floor. And above the glass floor, the survivor lives the life that he or she are supposed to live in the normal situation after the war. Why do I say glass floor? Because I want to indicate that the reality of the trauma is always somewhere in the psychological field of reference of the survivor. They may live in the reality that's above the floor. They may look ahead and deal with things that are around them above the glass floor, but somewhere in the periphery of their, so to speak, vision, they always see also the trauma world and the trauma reality. And the relationship between these two realities is not static, it's very dynamic. So anything that can trigger memories from the past, anything that can remind the survivor of it, can make the reality of the trauma rush up from below and actually not only come to the foreground, but overwhelm the reality of the here and now. And I'll show you what I mean. This, by the way, is important for me to mention. Actually, when we look at natural disasters, this is a chart from a study by the World Health Organization, we see that the level of mental disorders doubles essentially after severe emergencies. And these are emergencies that were only related to natural disasters and not to malignant trauma. And it's important to look at these numbers, which are collected today close to the time of the event, to give us some sense of what might have been the numbers and the situation with Holocaust survivors, because we don't have original immediate data about them. We also know, I will go back to the dual reality in a minute. I'm sorry, I didn't notice that there was a little bit of a disorder here with the slide. We also know from data from across the globe, many studies across different countries and different situations, traumatic situations, that there are particularly severe effects in terms of people's ongoing level of functioning or impairment after trauma when people have had more than 4 traumatic events in their lifetime. 4 traumatic events in the lifetime is a threshold number that means that those who had 4 and more were much more impaired and much less functional than others. And as many of us who know Holocaust survivors and survivors of other atrocities know, people have lived through more than 4 such events, sometimes in a day, for a very long period of time. So indeed, when we look at the meta-analytic study of many studies of Holocaust survivors from different places in the world after the war, we see that symptoms persist for decades. In a study that was conducted in 2010, I will show you the graph. Survivors, both those who accessed some mental health services and those who never accessed mental health services. And by that point in 2010, they were, older, showed a very high level of post-traumatic stress disorders, even though in other ways, they were not that different from peers who did not go through the Holocaust, which is an amazing statement about their resilience as a population, as a general group, because if you think about the fact that in many other studies, 4 traumatic events or more were associated with significant impairment, it's actually quite an amazing finding. We also see a very high prevalence of symptoms, anxiety and depressive symptoms in many other people who lived as children during World War II, including Finnish children that were evacuated and separated from their families, and British children, and Danish and German war children. And we also see a high prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder and other post-traumatic reactions in survivors of the Cambodian Khmer Rouge, 35, 45 years after the end of the war. This is the graph that I mentioned to you. The 2 pillars in the center indicate the level of PTSD symptoms in survivors of the Holocaust in 2010, those who had some mental health assistance and those who didn't, who were totally never got any assistance, very high post-traumatic stress symptoms, despite a very good level of adjustment in any other way. It's very important to also mention in terms of the long-term effects on the survivors and in terms of the intergenerational and the intrafamilial effects of PTSD, that PTSD is often associated with a lot of anger. Anger is not one of the criteria of the disorder, but because people don't sleep well, because people have nightmares, because they wake up so tired and they have to go to work, because they are so hyper vigilant and hyper alert all the time, which takes a tremendous toll on our entire psychophysiological system. Because of all of those characteristics and criteria that we went over in the definition of what is post-traumatic stress disorder, people often are irritable, people often have rageful explosions and rageful outbursts, and anger is very, very much part of what we see in people who suffer from PTSD. We don't necessarily see it in people who, let's say, veterans who were in the same war theater as the veteran with the PTSD. But PTSD itself is associated with more anger, not the exposure to the trauma. So other things that are very impactful in the relationships of the survivors with their family members. Of course, these are also things that are detract from the survivor's own quality of life, but they also have a great impact on relationships, is the numbness and the detachment that I mentioned, which serve to protect the survivor from being triggered all the time, but leave them a little bit numb and detached sometimes, also from family members and from the capacity to get fully engaged in positive ways in the relationships and in the events of the family life after the war. And I bring you here the example of a very, very good friend of my parents with whom I grew up very close with his family. He was a lovely man. He was a handsome, jolly, generous man. He was a successful businessman, and he was always willing to help anybody and everybody. But he also had tremendous anger issues. And when he got triggered, he sometimes would become very violent. He once punched a policeman, he kicked the milkman. We had milkmen at the time in Israel. And sometimes before, I don't remember it, but my older brother and sister remember it, that his children who are older than I, they were like my brother and sister in age, would run to my parents' home to hide from him after he beat them very, very badly. So this very kind and good-hearted man sometimes couldn't control himself when he was triggered. And when he heard that I was doing my first study about the intergenerational transmission in families of Holocaust survivors, he said to me, "Ha, what are you doing this for? There are no effects of the Holocaust. You can take it from me. If you walk on human skulls, as he did in the concentration camp, if you walk on human skulls, after 3 days, you don't feel any different than walking on stones." And this is a very good and very poignant example, actually, of the defensive use of numbness and detachment. You have to numb yourself in situations like that in order to survive, in order to be able to function and not go out of your mind or stop functioning. But sometimes the defensive maneuver is not fully reversible. And so you can become a little bit numb to your own feelings and to the pain and to the feelings of other people around you. Other post-trauma reactions are also something we have to remember, because not everybody responds to trauma with post-traumatic stress disorder. Many people respond with anxiety and depression. And it's very easy to miss the fact that this depression or anxiety, especially in older people, is actually related to a trauma history, because they themselves sometimes don't think that their depression right now or their anxiety is related to what happened to them when they were 15 years old, 50 years ago. Family members often don't make that connection either. And so the relationship to what we call the index trauma, the event, the history of trauma, may be lost with older people, and sometimes even with younger people. They don't necessarily tell us about it. They don't necessarily establish the connection between what they're suffering from right now and the fact that they went through a trauma. And it's therefore on us as mental health providers to always routinely ask about a history of trauma and about symptoms of post-traumatic reactions. Some people even have psychotic features that are associated with their traumatic experiences. And in the past, it was always immediately taken to indicate that the person suffers from some form of a schizophrenic disorder. And one of my studies was conducted in Israel on a group of survivors who became psychotic in some way, had psychotic symptoms early on after the war, after the end of the Holocaust, after they immigrated to Israel, and spent decades, many decades by then. It was my study was done in 2005. These people have been in psychiatric hospitals all those years with psychotic symptoms. And even though it was so many years later, with all of the trouble that they've been through in psychiatric hospitals all these years and the terrible treatments that were available only pretty severe, with pretty severe side effects at the time, despite all of that, they really did not at all appear to be schizophrenic. And now we know that some people have PTSD with psychotic features. This is an example, by the way, of a psychotic feature. What you don't see is that this is a doily with some fake leaves that is stuck in the ceiling in the apartment of a survivor that was very functional in many, many ways and really managed to build herself a life with her 2 hands. She didn't even have a chance to learn to read before the war started. And she certainly didn't have a chance to learn to read in the United States, but she made a life for herself. She took care of babies. She created a good life, but she was still very, very paranoid and had this camera in the ceiling because she was sure that people are coming into her apartment and poisoning her. This is another picture from another patient who brought to me a picture of her father's apartment and what he has in the windows to alert him to potential burglars and people coming into his room. So what I want to stress is that we understand now that post-traumatic stress reactions and even post-traumatic stress disorder can coexist together with resilience. And they are oftentimes very much the picture that we see with survivors of extreme situations. Survivors can also be, in fact, hardened or steeled by their trauma experiences. And that sometimes is a very important part of resilience. That's a part that allows people to move forward despite their wounds, despite the terrible things that they went through, despite the fact that they don't sleep at night, and gives them the strength to push forward with all of these symptoms. But it can also make them a little bit hard towards others, make it harder to relax and to have a sense of well-being, and it also impacts family atmosphere and the relationship with their spouses and with their families, about which we will talk a lot more tomorrow. So as a result of all of these things, obviously many children of trauma survivors grow up with parents who are very well-adjusted and functioning well in many external ways, and yet continued to suffer from some level of post-traumatic symptoms that impacted the family and the relationship within the family. And those whose parents were child survivors might be a particularly vulnerable group because the child survivors were a particularly vulnerable group. I strongly recommend, and I would have shown you a clip of this movie if we were in the same room, the documentary Never Forget to Lie by Marianne Marzinski, who is a film director, a very successful one, who in his later years created a documentary about himself and about how at age 6, his mother, his loving mother, put him in the street with a sign that said, my name is whatever it was that she called him, the Polish name, which was not his Jewish real name. And she gave him a piece of bread with sugar and said, do not run after me. And that was the last time he saw his mother. Imagine at age 6, what kind of a trauma and how does a man live afterwards and build a life? So obviously, we also know by now that not only with the child survivors, but even with adults, there are specific changes in the brain, in the function of the brain, and in the structure of the brain, in the biochemistry of the brain, that are the result of trauma. We see a greater activity level in the amygdala, which is like the alarm system of the brain. And we see decreased activity in areas of the brain in the medial prefrontal cortex and in other areas that are actually related to what we call executive functioning and emotional control. So there are real neurochemical and structural changes in the brains of people with PTSD. And it's very important to understand it, especially with, of course, children who are exposed to extreme trauma. We also see in this country, and those will be also for those of you who are mental health professionals, these are part of our, the people that we see are people who went through traumas in the home. And traumas in the home are much more impactful in adverse ways on the development of children, because the trauma is inflicted by the people, the very same people that were supposed to protect the child. The adverse childhood experiences studies show us that in this country, a very, very large sample that represents the general population show that about 60% of the respondents reported at least one ACE, as we call it, adverse childhood experience, and that more than more than many of them, more than the other ACEs, which I'll show you in a second, physical and sexual abuse in childhood were the most problematic ones. But the adverse childhood experiences include, substance abuse in the home, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, battered mother, criminal behavior in the home, and of course, 3 categories of abuse: psychological, physical, or sexual, and 2 categories of neglect, emotional or physical. And the 7 categories, the various categories of the ACEs were very much strongly interrelated. And just to give you a sense, those who had more than 4 categories were between 4 times to 12 times more likely to have all kinds of increased health risks, including alcoholism and drug abuse and depression and suicide attempt and all kinds of other things related to both psychological and physical health in adulthood later in life. So obviously, it brings us to the fact that we have now a lifespan perspective on aging, and we recognize that the way people age and the way people experience their aging is very much dependent on what type of stuff we have lived through, what type of things we have encountered in our lives. And the scope of these problems is enormous. And we know now that in particular, those who came out of traumatic situations with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic symptoms, we see that that is associated with much poorer health in the older years. It's also associated, of course, with depression and anxiety, which are often comorbid with post-traumatic stress disorder. So who are the people who will be at risk in their later years? The people with combat-related PTSD, and though we have pretty high percentages of those by now of the different conflicts that American forces were involved with. We have a fantastic documentary, which I again recommend, Gen Silent, which is about the generation of gay and lesbian and transgender, queer and transgender people in this country who actually came out of the closet first and broke that taboo of being open about it in the 60s and 70s, and are now aging and are going back into the closet because of their fear of the reactions of healthcare providers and health aid providers that come into their homes. And we have, and by the way, there's an enormous, of course, history of trauma with these people throughout their lives. The levels of interpersonal violence that they were exposed to is much higher than the general population that I reported to you in the beginning here in the United States. And of course, we have many people who suffered racial violence, and I have to do here something to express my deep gratitude to my mentor and professor, Rabbi Professor Eugene Weiner, who is the man there next to the nun who walked in Selma, in the march in Selma with Dr. Martin Luther King. And so we have all of these people with histories of violence and trauma that will become patients because PTSD and other post-traumatic stress reactions are so much correlated with health problems and psychological problems in the later years. And despite the fact that the correlation is so strong, PTSD is often underdiagnosed, not only in the elderly, but definitely among the elderly, where it's so easy to say, oh, the person is just depressed because they're so old, and obviously in their situation, maybe I would be depressed too, or miss the connection to the traumatic event, or think that it's something related to a medical problem, because many times older people with post-traumatic symptoms will not speak about the psychological symptoms, but more about their somatic symptoms, and they will come to the general practitioner rather than seek mental health assistance. And that's why it's so important that we are aware of the fact and that we need to ask about it. I know that actually I'm supposed to stop any minute now, so I will skip a little bit and just mention that obviously we also have to be aware, due to all of these things, we have to be aware of the fact that there will be many people with post-traumatic reactions of all kinds due to COVID and due to the impact of the measures that had to be employed by people to protect themselves and their communities. The social distancing can be very, very detrimental to the mental health of older people in particular. And we had what we call a syndemic now, has been called by some people, which is the synchronized effect of various things, including the pandemic. So we had Black Lives Matter and the horrible instances of police brutality that were shared in the media and that we're all aware of. And we have a tremendous increase in domestic violence due to the situation. All of those things will be causes for potential increase in traumatic exposure for a lot of people across the globe and in this country, of course, as well. And we want to be prepared for it. We want to learn the lessons from everything we gained through the pain and suffering of so many people in the Holocaust and in other terrible situations. We want to be able to help a little more quickly than some of these populations were helped. And I will stop with secondary traumatization, which is the term we use for all of those who are not directly exposed to trauma, but are exposed through it through their close connection with someone else. And that usually pertains to family members, about whom we will talk more tomorrow. And as my colleague and friend Charles Figley put it, simply being a member of a family and caring deeply about its members makes us emotionally vulnerable to the catastrophes which impact them. It is also true for us as mental health professionals and medical professionals. Our connection with the trauma survivor is also impacting us, not to mention that in this particular situation of the pandemic and everything else that we are living through, we are all going through something together. So we'll talk a little bit more about secondary traumatization tomorrow, and I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Felsen. As I mentioned before, if you have questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Felsen, please put them in the chat, and then I will try and relay them and keep an eye on the chat, because I'm sure that will raise more questions.
Yes, I just wanted to actually get a chance to mention this too, which is that we also know that there is post-traumatic growth after trauma, and that some people also speak about the fact that having gone through trauma has left them with a greater clarity about their own strength and about their priorities. Often people talk about a deeper appreciation for life, for the meaning of relationships, that it helped them see different new possibilities, and that it gave them a certain spiritual depth. And these are things that are not, it's not to say that people would have chosen to go through the trauma to gain it, but things that people do say they gained because of the terrible things they endured.
Well, I have a question here. One of the first one is, are there links of PTSD to dementia?
Yes. Unfortunately, and that is one of the things that I'm very, very glad for this comment or question, because there is almost like a double level of risk for dementia in people who suffer from PTSD, from chronic PTSD, as opposed to people who went through similar traumas but did not develop PTSD. For example, there are studies about veterans with or without dementia who were in the same war theater. So it's not the exposure to the trauma itself that increases the likelihood of dementia, but PTSD increases the likelihood of dementia. And that is very important for us as professionals to know, because it means that a lot more of the people that we see as elderly people with dementia have traumatic histories. And when they act like something is terrifying them, or they're telling us that they're seeing the Nazi dogs are coming to bite them, or the Nazis hit them in the night, or all of those things, we need to actually understand where it's coming from and treat it respectfully.
And is that link to dementia related to the physical damage and physical things that are going on in the brain as a result of the PTSD?
That's an excellent question. And we think that there is a much more complicated relationship, probably definitely a bidirectional relationship between trauma and dementia, in the sense that people with dementia are their inhibitions and their defenses, the things that prevented them from manifesting PTSD more openly before, are gone with the dementia. So we see more PTSD amongst them. And also that PTSD, because of all of the things that we talked about, the changes in the brain, the malnutrition, whatever it was that is related to such a heavy toll on our physiological system, can contribute to that. We also know now that there are certain genetic sensitivities to PTSD, and all of that put together does mean that we have to be aware of the fact that, I'm saying it with great pain, because actually at the time when I visited a very well-respected hospice care place where someone close to me was hospitalized, the psychiatrist in charge, who was a very good professional, totally dismissed my comment about, the content of the enactment of scenes and fears related to the Holocaust. He was like, no, this is just sundowning. Everybody has it here. Well, no, it's sundowning indeed, but some people have terrible reenactments of their trauma histories, whether it's from the war, whether it's from the Holocaust. We see it in studies, we see it in research. It's a well-known phenomenon by now, well-established phenomenon, and one can't dismiss it like that. One has to understand that it's different.
I'm also seeing a question here. Someone is saying that, looking at all of these statistics and the extent of trauma in so many different populations, it's a massive tsunami heading our way. What can we as a society do?
So I think that this is an amazing comment. I am so worried indeed about the fact that that this is not a mental health issue. It's a social issue. We have to recognize that we are now living through a collective trauma with many people impacted personally, and other people impacted, by secondary traumatization. And we have to look at it as a social issue that needs to be addressed by policies, needs to be addressed by different priorities in terms of spending. We have to come up with new ways of offering social supportive services before people need mental health support proper. We know now also from studies of many recent trauma-exposed populations that PTSD often sets in with a delay. After quite a while, a person comes out of the trauma and does not have PTSD, but when there isn't sufficient social support around them, they develop PTSD sometime later. So if we get in there in time and provide social supports, and social supports have to do with allowing people ways to connect, ways to be productive, ways to feel that they have control over their lives again. It has to do with jobs. It has to do with occupational support. It has to do with all of these things that allow people to regain control over their lives and not fall into PTSD because there wasn't enough scaffolding around them in terms of social and occupational possibilities.
Thank you. Here's another interesting question. Do you think that the Holocaust trauma affects all Jewish people on a cellular level, meaning that Jewish people feel the trauma in their bodies and souls more than non-Jewish people would? So it's a physical manifestation.
I think there are two parts to the question, and I'll try to address both of them. First of all, is the trauma of the Holocaust perhaps closer to home to Jewish people than to other people? I am sure it is, as I am sure that other traumatic histories of other groups are not quite as close to my heart as to their heart. You know, there is, we have each our histories and the people that we love who went through them. And of course, there is that sense about it. I think that it's this is the Jewish atrocity, and there are many others. No shortage of them. But is it a physiological thing? Is it something that is in our cells? Well, we have now this whole new field of epigenetics that has given us very interesting evidence, not only in Jewish survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants, but also in descendants in Scandinavia, in descendants of the Dutch 6 months hunger that was imposed by the Nazis, in descendants of veterans of the independence war in this country. You know, we see that the descendants of people who lived through traumatic experiences have changes, show changes in the manifestation of their DNA. So it's not that the DNA itself changes, but the way that it manifests itself changes in ways that, for example, in the children of Holocaust survivors, it's possible that it's related to the fact that children of survivors, upon reaching middle age, have a higher frequency of developing hypertension and prediabetes and conditions that might be related to the fact that our parents went through such a prolonged period of starvation that the epigenetic change is such that it prepares their offspring for survival under conditions of scarcity of food. And since we are not living in scarcity, thankfully, our bodies are unable to handle the diet as well, because we're really prepared for a very different and much harder and harsher situation. So is it in our cells? Very possibly. And as I said, there is also some evidence now that there are particular genetic susceptibilities to PTSDs. So some people with those particular genetic markers might be more susceptible to it. And given the fact that the history of the Jewish people is replete with pogroms and all kinds of terrible things, it's very possible that in our cells, we have some kind of a sensitivity that is different from other people. But at the same time, other people who went through terrible historical traumatic events may also have that for different reasons.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't see any other questions. If I'll give people a few minutes to share anything that they might want to ask.
They don't have to ask. They can also have comments if they want.
This is not about the program again. Chris, you sent me a new link, but the link says noon tomorrow.
Yeah, I replied to that. You can check your email.
Okay, thank you.
Well, here's an interesting question. How would you describe COVID in relationship to collective trauma?
COVID, the pandemic is a collective trauma.
Interesting.
If you're defining trauma as if you look back to the right, if we look back to the definition of PTSD, right? Right, exposure by direct exposure, witnessing, or secondary exposure to something that is very life-threatening, to somebody being injured, to somebody being dying, to somebody, we are all exposed to it at this point. I think some of us, of course, very directly, those of us who had someone, a loved one that got sick, or a loved one that died of COVID, but many of us know quite in the next level of circle of people around us, somebody who died of COVID. So, and the whole situation, the disruption to our lives, the threat that is in the air all the time, nobody is protected from it. Nobody is completely sure that they're not going to get it, or that somebody that they love is not going to get it. This is absolutely a collective trauma.
That's interesting. And we also saw, for those of us who work with survivors, especially in the early months of the shutdown, it was when people, when the isolated seniors who were survivors weren't able to get food, it was extremely traumatic.
Extremely. For the survivors, there are so many triggers, potential triggers in this situation. Being confined to their apartments, or to their rooms, even to their houses. But being confined and not being able to go out because something outside is very dangerous is a trigger. Not maybe having food, depending on somebody else to bring you your food, bring you your medication, being helpless and depending on someone else for that is a potential trigger. There's so many potential triggers, not to mention, of course, all the other things that happened, right? The police brutality, the riots, the potential for disorder and for social disorder. All of that is extremely triggering for survivors and for their children.
Well, and which brings me to a question here that maybe you can give us a little sneak preview of tomorrow. How do you see the COVID pandemic's impact on second generation survivors of the Holocaust?
Yeah, so we'll certainly talk about it tomorrow. And I have a lot to say about it, because actually just today I got confirmation that an empirical study that I did together with my colleague from Bar-Ilan University about the reactions of the second generation to COVID was accepted for publication. So I'm very happy about that. And what we found out is that at least for the second generation that we managed to sample, and I have to stress that that is not, there was not a random sampling that represents the entire variability within the second generation, but a particular group, we call it a convenience sample. People like the people who are listening to me now, the people who follow my blog, the people who participated in multiple webinars that I gave during these months, Those were the people that we sampled. And in those people, what we found, which is very consistent with previous findings in the second generation, we found out that children of survivors who had a parent that they described, according to the symptom list that we gave them, as somebody that we would diagnose with PTSD, whether it was one parent or two parents, those people were different than second generation whose parents they did not describe as having PTSD symptoms, and of course the control subjects. And the difference was that those with parents who had PTSD felt much more distress during COVID. They had much higher levels of anxiety and depressive symptoms than the other ones. And they also described feeling much lonelier. They had higher levels of loneliness, even though when we asked also about all of the possible social supports that people have, they did not have less social supports around them, and they did not have a lesser degree of contact with their social supports, but they nonetheless felt much more lonely. And we'll talk about that a lot more tomorrow, because that's very consistent with other findings that we have about the second generation and about the particular sort of way in which they're very resilient as a group. And our sample definitely was a sample of very resilient, highly achieving, high functioning second generation. And at the same time, that those who had a parent with post-traumatic stress disorder have certain hidden vulnerabilities, if you like, that are triggered at particular difficult times in life. And COVID is one of those difficult times in life for many of us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that preview. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We've actually exceeded our deadline. So we're looking forward to tomorrow morning and a lot more interesting information to come. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.